you'll need to turn it on. If you'll just get it on there, just mainly the top half of it's what really needs to be seen. I don't know if it'll all go on there or not. Well, we're on a very interesting subject this evening thank you. Yes, that's my introduction. For the retrospectively inquisitive scientific mind, I don't suppose that there is anything more interesting or more intriguing to the young and the old alike than is the subject of the existence of the great dinosaurs of the past. We were recently by the Field Museum down in Chicago, and I remember, to interrupt my story before I tell you that story, I remember back at the very beginning of, of this class, I guess it was. Yeah, it would have been back at the very beginning of what we're teaching on right now. In creation and the flood, there was more than one individual here who was a little hesitant in passing judgment on either the existence or the lack of it of the dinosaurs. We all know what we were taught back in high school and back in college, if we were unfortunate enough to go to the latter. Some of what we learned was right. We learned what 2 plus 2 was, but of course a lot of the things that we learned weren't so right, and so that, I guess, makes people think twice about the actual existence of any of these great, well, the vegetarians like Brontosaurus. We saw him down at the Field Museum. And the carnivores like Mr. Tyrannosaurus Rex, which means the king of the dinosaurs, saw him down there at the museum. Been there for years. My mother went there on a field trip when she was back in high school and saw the same dinosaurs still sitting in the same place. So they haven't revamped the Field Museum, I don't suppose, not in that regard anyway. I had some pictures to bring, but they were on a snapshot camera, Instamatic camera, and they just didn't turn out very well inside. I've got some more on my 35 millimeter camera, and we haven't gotten those prints because we hadn't taken them to be developed. That's why we don't have them back yet. But it's fascinating whenever you're actually standing at the foot of these dinosaurs. The Tyrannosaurus Rex is like 20 feet tall. I mean, it wasn't plaster Paris or anything. It was the real thing. All the bones all fit together. And he had a skull that was just tremendous. I mean, as large as your whole chest area, and teeth that were just tremendous. And if you remember anything we said about Behemoth and Leviathan, that should have answered your questions about the existence of dinosaurs in the past. And we saw Behemoth there. That's what the Brontosaurus was. Remember, it was Behemoth, who has a tail like a cedar tree and is thick through the loins. He can stay where it's marshy, or he can get up on tops of the hills. That rules out hippopotamuses, rhinoceroses, crocodiles, and all types of other animals that people have posed to fit the, or try to fit the descriptions of what we have. That's Job 40:41, if that's new for anyone here. Which means they lasted down to the time of Job, because Job, or God's giving Job a very good description. And it's not as though Job didn't know what he was talking about, or how could he even compare his strength or the lack of Job's wisdom about anything with these animals unless Job knew of what he spoke. So we saw those down there. I trust you realize now that these huge creatures actually did exist at one time. I mean, everything that we have today, all trees, all plants, all fish, all birds. I've got a picture of one here. I don't believe they had him down there with a wingspan of over 20 feet. We don't have birds like that anymore. The largest we have is the California condor, and there's not many of those left. Just a few left in California, and doesn't even approximate the size of some of the great prehistoric birds that existed, as well as insects, grasshoppers that look like a mouse back then. And I mean, all these things really did exist. I was amazed. You know, it takes you about a minute, I guess, just to walk around the creature. That's how big he is. His tail must have been 30 feet, 40 feet long, just curled all. It was big, you know, when it joined his body and got down to, well, pencil size by the time it got to the very end. And they've got all of these creatures reconstructed. So they really did exist, but whenever we raise the question of their existence, then right along with that comes the problem of their disappearance. We know that we don't have any of those roaming around in our backyards today. They're not roaming around anywhere today. Now, you might say, thank God that they're not. But remember, the fear that we studied last time came after the flood. So we would be protected from those creatures if they existed today. And some of them you wouldn't want to be absent anyway. The brontosaurus is not going to hurt anyone. He might be a problem for all those in ecology. He eats too much for most people. But we could probably find a park for him to exist somewhere. What an attraction. But of course, if we had him, it wouldn't be an attraction to everyone. That, well, I know what a brontosaurus looks like. But I mean, that's right in the Bible. I just want to go back over there. It's so interesting to me just to go back to Job very quickly before we get into our subject to look at old Brontosaurus Behemoth here, because it's touching. I didn't get down on the floor and kneel or anything like that when I got in his presence, but it was touching to be in front of a creature like that. Of all the creatures, of all the land animals that God could have chosen, in giving a description of their gigantic stature to Job, he chose the Brontosaurus. And this is in Job 15. Now, we've got a whole tape on these creatures here. But in Job 40 and verse 15. So you need to mark out of your margin the elephant. Elephant does not have a tail like a cedar. Behold now Behemoth, which I made with thee, he eateth grass as an ox. Lo, now his strength is in his loins, and his force is in the navel of his belly. And you should have seen how round that creature was. And he moveth his tail like a cedar. Well, have you seen a rhinoceros's tail? He can hardly move it like a cedar. He could twitch it in the wind. Now, he's got a trunk that might be like a cedar, but he doesn't have a tail like one. The sinews of his stones are wrapped together. His bones are as strong as pieces of brass. His bones are like bars of iron, and he is the chief of the ways of God. Now, of course, you go over to chapter 41, verse 33, and you learn that when he says that he's the chief of the ways of God, he's talking about land animals, because Leviathan was the greatest creature that was created. Chapter 41:33, upon earth there is not his like, who was made without fear. So Leviathan was the greatest, but upon earth, Behemoth was king. And then down in verses 21 through 24, which rules out all the other animals that people have tried to put in Behemoth's place, taking the mask off just the Hebrew word, which simply is the plural word for beasts, used many times, remember, in the Old Testament simply for cattle, because all it means is beast. But here it's used as a plural of intensity, not a plural in reality where you've got more than one Behemoth, but a plural of intensity, that he is the beast and then some. But down in those verses, we find out that he can live where you've got some marshy area as well as live up on the hills. And so this would have to be our Brontosaurus. So I trust we're all in agreement on the fact that the dinosaurs really did exist. But the next problem that comes along is their disappearance, because they did exist. They're not here today. Something happened to them. If you look in Genesis 6 and verse 19, I believe it's safe to say that this creature was on board the chest, the ark that Noah built. Now, while you're turning there, I'm reading a footnote from your textbook, The Genesis Flood, on page 69. I've mentioned this before, but I thought I'd read it to you because they've placed their comments here on the dinosaurs down in the footnote. They say extinct animals, such as the dinosaurs, may also have been represented on the ark, probably by very young animals, only to die out because of hostile environmental conditions after the flood. And that all sounds well so far. But then, semicolon, it seems more likely, however, that animals of this sort were not taken on the ark at all for the very reason of their intended extinction, which means, in other words, God foresaw and foreknew that they would become extinct, and so just didn't go to the trouble of putting them on board. And it's interesting that Morrison Whitcomb would put that in a footnote and even bring that up when they're so insistent from like chapter 7, verses 19 to 21, that each time we see the word all, each, and every, that it means just that. It means all the hills, every creature under the whole of heaven. And they're very dogmatic about that it was a universal flood and not a local flood. Well, we've got one of those words back in chapter 6 and verse 19. And of every living thing of all flesh. We've got two of those words. Every living thing of all flesh. Two of every sort shalt thou bring into the ark to keep them alive with thee. The purpose was to keep the animals alive, not foreseeing that they were going to become extinct later on. Noah doesn't have any idea about extinction taking place later on. Now, if you got any questions about the possibility of some of the animals becoming extinct prior to the flood, we've got no justification, no belief for that, because the world was just right for the animals. It was a lush environment everywhere, from the pole to the equator and from the east to the west. So why are you going to become extinct? Doesn't matter if some of the animals like Tyrannosaurus rex did become carnivorous in their appetite and did begin to eat animals like Brontosaurus whenever they could catch them. There's so many of them, they're not going to kill all of them all. It would have taken something greater than just the presence of carnivores. And even if you say that the carnivores, destroyed creatures like Brontosaurus, then who destroyed the carnivores? There was no one that could tangle with the dinosaur Tyrannosaurus rex. He was the king of the dinosaurs. Brontosaurus wasn't going to get some of his friends together and be able to come anywhere near defeating Tyrannosaurus rex, because he was a huge creature that would just bite right through the neck of a creature like Brontosaurus. I use those two because they're two well-known dinosaurs from Sunday school. Of course, there are multitudes of different types of dinosaurs. And you might not have realized that this applies in the area of fish and of insects and of reptiles. Well, dinosaurs are reptiles. Of plants and of trees and of all your various marine life. It applies to everything. We had huge specimens in these various categories that existed back in that day that we don't have with us today. I mean, we've seen the remains, fossil remains of trees and of plants that we just don't have around. I mean, we still have, your various plants that existed then. A lot of them exist, but they don't grow as big as they used to. I'm going to give you an example here in a few moments that was unearthed in Siberia that is simply stupendous when you think about it. But these creatures did exist, and they disappeared from the scene of history. I can't say without a trace, because there is a trace of them, or we would know that they're still around, or that they were around at that time. We do have traces of them, and we'll get into that, the study of fossils, in a later message. But what we want to look at tonight is the subject of extinction, because it's very fascinating, as I say, to the young and to the old alike, to think of these great creatures that we had at one time. And then to follow that thought with the thought of what happened to them. And of course, if you've ever been to school, you know of all the theories that have been raised concerning what happened to the great dinosaurs of the past. Most of the theories can be placed under the theories of the Ice Age. We had a repetitious problem of ice coming down from the North Pole and coming up from the South Pole. And of course, most people believe, whenever they don't think about anything, that the Earth has always existed like it does today, insofar as we had cold weather and climates at the North and South Pole and relatively warm in between. Now, even some of your scientists are beginning to abandon some of these views because of the scientific evidence that we have against the belief that the Earth as we know it today has always existed in this state. Now, I don't really want to get into the Ice Age theories tonight. I think I've got that down for the future. Because, you see, it's important that our children know what's right and what's wrong in these areas. And it's important for we adults to know, because we're continually being bombarded in the commercials and in the magazines and newspapers and just in casual conversation of the Neanderthal man. And I mean, I'm talking about educated people that really believe in these theories. I passed by a couple, an older man and lady. You think that they would have, been to school back whenever they knew better than to believe stuff like this. Passed by them when they were looking at some of these dinosaurs. Oh, no, they were looking at some of the men. They were looking at Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon, Peking, Java Man. You remember all those? A lot of those proved to be hoaxes. Teeth from pigs in Nebraska. And a whole lot of other garbage that people have invented, trying to put all these things together. And the Australopithecus and all the other ones that we looked at. They were just sitting there. I heard what they were saying, and I just about had the boldness to interrupt them. But I decided not to. We were all by ourselves. They was back on a back row somewhere, and they were just saying, look at there, we really used to look like that. And they were just going on and on. And I thought, if you want to believe that, I'm not going to ruin your fairy tale for you then. That's not something I'd want to dream about, though. That my grandfather was actually that hairy and actually that dumb. Makes me wonder about myself then. Maybe that's why we're in the mess we're in. We really aren't people like we think we are. No, but it makes you wonder. It seems like that to the educated man that would humble him, if anything. I mean, who in the educated world of our day would want to believe that his grandfather was really a chimpanzee and his grandfather was an orangutan? And his grandfather was an ape, and his grandfather was a gorilla, and then I don't know how far they want to go back. That insults the intelligence of a human being. Metamorphosized human being, I guess. That's come out of the Darwinian theories and stage of evolution. Well, we've gone over all that before, but we want to look some at extinction tonight. And it's interesting to look at what has been found and where some things have been found. I want to give you a few things here before we get into our main subject. Just for your own information, make sure your children remember these things, because maybe their science teachers don't realize these truths if they haven't done some study. It's popular knowledge today, prevalent in many different places. It's not something you've got to look for. One case is, and these can be multiplied hundreds of times. I'll give you some more statistics here in a few moments, because I do have a lot of statistics. But one case is a rhinoceros, the full remains, I mean the carcass. We're not talking about bones now. Bones, we've known about bones for centuries. We don't have any problem, and most people don't have any problem with bones. And then they get their fossil remains from that. But we're talking about the carcasses of the animals. Now, before I even get into that, let me make another comment. 99 and about 9/10% of the time, the carcass of any animal anywhere except on a highway, and it depends on how busy the highway is, vanishes in a day or two by carnivores. You see, carnivores are always on the lookout for dead animals. And about the only place they can't get to them is on the highway because there are too many cars. And generally then the cars hit them enough times that there aren't enough remains for the vultures to come down and feed on. But how many times have you been driving along and there's some old crows or ravens, depends on where you are. Of course, these are carnivores, the crow and the raven. Of course, they can eat vegetation too, but they are carnivores. You'll see a whole group of them down the side of the road. Or if you're out in a wild enough area, you'll see a lot of turkey vultures down right beside the road, just eating and eating, and as soon as your car gets close enough, they take off. As soon as you're gone by, here they come again. So what I'm saying is, it is extremely rare ever to find the carcass of an animal anywhere. If you find one, it's only been there a couple of days. Because I'll tell you what, something that likes that type of meat's going to find it in an instant of time. And they're supposed to, and that helps, keep the environment clean and so forth. So let that be known at the very beginning, that if you find a carcass, doesn't matter how small or how large, because even insects will get in there and begin to eat. But if you find one, then it's pretty rare. So we're not talking about bones now. We'll talk about bones in another message. We're going to talk about their carcasses being found. A rhinoceros was found in Siberia, which is now stuffed in the Zoological Museum in Leningrad. And right along with the rhinoceros, there was found a saber-toothed tiger, an antelope, a ground sloth, and 2 camels. Now, where in the world do camels live? Well, where in the world do all of these creatures live? The antelope, well, you know where tigers live. And the rhinoceros in Siberia, they only have a summer that lasts from July the 13th through August the 5th. How would you like that for a summer? That's about 3-week summer. You've got a 49-week winter in Siberia. And when it's summer, it always frosts at night. I mean, as soon as the sun goes down, the frost sets in. And they only have a summer that lasts from July the 13th through August the 5th in northern Siberia. So it's interesting to find what has been found and then to realize where these creatures have been found. Because the rhinoceros, saber-toothed tiger, the antelope, I just picked these out of a long list because some of the other ones you might say, well, they could have lived there. By the way, the only creatures that live there are 4 that live there. The snowy owl, the raven, the Arctic fox, and the polar bear. All 4, notice, are carnivores. Now that'll be important as you'll realize later on. The polar bear, the Arctic fox, the snowy owl, and what was the other one? The raven. And you have to be a very hardy animal to live in a climate like that. You think of all the animals that we have that live in our warm climates, like here in this state. And there you've got a region of thousands and thousands of square miles, and you've got a big variety of 4 animals that live there. And it's not the rhinoceros, the saber-toothed tiger, the antelope, and the camel. It's animals that, as we know them today, we would expect them to be able to live in a region like that. Something else found in Siberia, as a matter of fact, it was found in the New Siberian Islands, 600 miles north of the Arctic Circle. The famous Arctic explorer Baron Toll, T-O-L-L, found a 90-foot plum tree with green leaves and ripe fruit. And we've got 2 plum trees in our backyard. So I know something about plum trees. And they don't grow to be 90 feet. I mean, I don't know many trees that grow to be 90 feet. Maybe your palm, your coconut palm and your date palm. There's a couple that I can think of that would grow to be 90 feet tall. How would you like a fruit tree 90 feet tall? And Baron Toll found this in the New Siberian Islands, 600 miles north of the Arctic Circle. If you would put the transparency on, just to make sure you realize what and where we're talking about here. We're not talking about where things like this can normally be found. The only plant that grows in this region is the willow, and it grows to be 1 inch high. How do you like that compared with 90 feet? This right here is the Arctic Circle. We're going to basically be talking about Alaska and Siberia. Now this is all of Siberia in this general region. You can put out of your mind the comment down there. It's the only map I could find that would have all this. Well, I better say something. I'm going to keep the people on the tape in suspense. No, I just keep them in suspense. Above the dotted line, this is Siberia. Now, can you bring it back over this way a little bit more, and you can see which part of Alaska, not very much of it, but which part of Alaska extends above the Arctic Circle. Right here. Now, Alaska is really not that bad. People think of Alaska being so terrible, but Alaska has much milder winters than we have here in Minnesota, because you see, we catch the brunt of the Arctic wind that comes right down through the middle of Canada. So if you don't know that, you might want to be moving to Alaska, because many times, especially, around Anchorage and this region, they have a much milder winter. People think of Alaska as being nothing but cold and snow, but it gets much colder. I mean, the cold record temperatures are always set in Montana, Minnesota, North Dakota, because that's right in the middle of the country, and that's just where you catch your cold air. You see, on either coast, you've got the seas that help keep things warm, Pacific Ocean, Atlantic. But when you're here in the middle of the country, like in North Dakota or Montana, which is where this country's record temperature low has been set years ago, in Minnesota, it's cold. So we're talking about up where it's cold. Now, in Siberia, we're not talking about Alaska now. In Siberia, as I say, they've got a summer that lasts from July the 13th through August the 6th. The only thing that grows there is a 1 inch high little willow plant. It's trying to be a willow tree, but all it gets each summer is 1 inch, and then there it goes. And the ground in that region is known as the tundra, because it almost perpetually stays frozen over, and it's known as the Arctic tundra. You'll only find the 4 animals that I mentioned before found in this region. Now, it's interesting that Baron Toll found a 90-foot plum tree. Of course, it would be frozen and preserved there because it's always cold there. For the most part, it's always cold. And you get up far enough and it's always cold. I mean, you could get right there on the line and you do have a mild summer sometimes. But when you get up in the islands, the New Siberian Islands, which you see north of the USSR, it's going to be cold perpetually there. It's not a place you'd want to live. It's not a place where most animals would want to live. It's not a place where you'd find 90-foot or any foot plum trees growing. And he found it with green leaves and ripe fruit on the tree. Now, there are just scores of these things that I could give you. I picked out some of the outstanding ones, so remember these so that you can inform someone and help them out in their ignorance if they don't realize these things. Now, anyone that knows anything about history has heard of Baron Toll because he was a famous explorer like Marco Polo, except he just explored another region, the Arctic region. Yes. No, I don't. But it's been a long time ago, like over 100 years ago. I don't have the date. Maybe I can look that up, but I've got dates for most of these things down here. So in this region, we've got this type of tree being found, various plants, insects being found, but those are generally rare because they're so small. I mean, it's like looking for a needle in a haystack to ever find, even if it's a giant insect, preserved anywhere in Siberia. It's much easier to find things like a 90-foot plum tree and things like dinosaur remains. What's interesting about these trees that they find is that they generally extend through 10 to 15 levels of strata. And of course, each level of strata represents so many millions of years ago. And of course, since a tree couldn't live 1 million years, then in one strata you'll have to find one certain type of tree. And if it ever breaks through to other stratas, you got one of two possibilities. Either that tree lived for millions and millions of years, and that's how it got into several layers, or there's been some type of cataclysmic change in the earth that has reversed everything and made it look like a tree lived several million years. When really it's in the strata that's dated, 3 million years ago, and it's also in the strata that's dated 500,000 years ago. And you see parts of animals are scattered throughout the various levels of strata. Very interesting. But the most interesting of all things is what we want to basically look at, and that is the giant woolly mammoth that existed. Now I've got some pictures. Again, the faithful ones on the first few rows, I guess, will be the only ones that get to see it.
That's right.
1977, gold prospectors turned over with a bulldozer in northern Siberia the complete remains of the carcass of a baby giant woolly mammoth whom they named Daima. And here's a picture of Daima. 1977, gold prospectors turned over with a bulldozer in northern Siberia the complete remains of the carcass of a baby giant woolly mammoth whom they named Daima. And here's a picture of Daima. Now, Daima lived several millions of years ago, remember. And this was found 1977. I mean, this wasn't prehistoric or something. This was found by educated people that are looking for gold. You got to be bright to go look for gold. I hear they discovered gold in Minnesota now, up north, coming out of the Canadian mountains. Now, if you don't know what a mammoth is, it's similar to our Indian elephant, but much larger and woolly. That's why they call it the woolly mammoth, because it's all covered with hair. Now, this is little Daima that was found, unearthed in 1977 by gold prospectors in northern Siberia. Complete carcass. Now, remember what we're talking about in all these weeks we've been studying. We're talking about the flood now. So keep that in the back of your mind, because that ties in with all that what we're saying right now. We just won't get to all of our conclusions tonight, but we'll whet your appetite for what we have to consider about these things. The most famous of the mammoths that's ever been discovered is known as the Beresovka mammoth, Beresovka, found in 1901. Beresovka, Beresovka. 1901. Now, these pictures are difficult to see. These are from the Smithsonian Institution, and they're taken on the spot where the Beresovka mammoth was found, and so you've got a lot of background material here that you really can't pick out. Well, there's really not any sense in showing it to you because you really can't see from there, but I do have a picture of the animal exactly as it was found, stuffed, and it's in the Zoological Museum in Leningrad. Now, if you look closely, you can see the remains of the hair on the animal. Now, remember, you're looking at a creature, according to them, that's several million years old. And even if he's not several million, think about several thousand years old. It's still rather remarkable, because we're not looking at bones now. We're talking about the animal as it actually lived and walked around the day before it died. It has full flesh. As a matter of fact, in Beresovka, this is the position in which he was found. He had in his stomach 24 pounds of vegetation. Now, vegetation, remember, doesn't grow there. He had unchewed bean pods still between his teeth. And he also was found with buttercups in his stomach. If you want to come up here, you're welcome to. It's fascinating. Those, of course, not all of you can reach it. I'll bring it back around that way for you, because you want to see what this looks like. Unchewed bean pods. Beans don't grow there. Beans grow where you can get some sun, and get some warmth, for some photosynthesis. Not much gets photosynthesized in Siberia. Buttercups. Well, we've got buttercups around here. Buttercups don't grow in Siberia. 24 pounds of vegetation, 1901. Some of these creatures, as a matter of fact, have been found in upright positions, like with a foot lifted as though he were moving. And they are, well, it looks almost like a wax museum when you see them, because in some manner they were absolutely frozen right in the position where they stood. Some of them had their mouths open. They were chewing something they had in their mouth and locked right in that place. Just like, you'd lock a camera right, when you're viewing a movie, and you'd say, stop it there, and it's frozen right there in mid-action. Some of them are. Some of them are sitting down, some of them are standing up, but some of them are in walking position with one leg lifted as though he were fixing to take another step. Now, underneath Beresovka was found green grass. Much green grass. And what's so interesting is when you consider how cold this region is. This picture is the right hind foot. The top picture and the bottom one is its left forefoot. You don't have to remember that, but it's 2 feet over here on the my right and your left hand. You again can see some of the hair in the picture. And we don't have any of these creatures around today. I think they've got some other ones here. Here's a piece of Beresovka's skin. Now, I've already showed you the picture of little Lima, but here's Beresovka's skin, and you can really see the hair on it. This was the woolly mammoth. Hair and everything all still intact. Now this one, remember, was found in Siberia. That's where our general success has been. 217 mammoth carcasses have been found in the state of New York, here in this country. In the bogs of peat moss, 217 carcasses have been found. 39 complete carcasses have been found in Siberia thus far. Now the ones found in New York were far from complete. But 39 of these, either totally or for the most part complete, have been found in Siberia. Now one question we have to ask here is, why haven't more of these been found in Siberia? Now I've got, I think, another book with the same picture. Well, I just happened to open it to Tyrannosaurus. This is exactly what we saw down there. On your right, the skeletal remains. You see, we don't have full carcasses of these animals. That's what's unique about the woolly mammoth. We still have the carcass. As a matter of fact, let me tell you something else that's interesting about the story. Whenever these creatures, these woolly mammoths, were found, of course, a lot of them were found back at the beginning of this century, and the people that found them generally, were on sleds with dogs, and the dogs were so hungry that they ate the meat. The meat was delicious. And whenever the men saw the dogs eating the meat, then they sat down and cut some steaks off the mammoth, and they ate the meat themselves. Didn't die or anything. It was tasted just like perfectly good meat to them. See, it's been in the deep freezer now, according to evolutionists, for millions of years, which is pretty hard to believe. It's more reasonable of our belief they've been in the deep freeze for several thousand years. So there's Tyrannosaurus rex. Now, he's a meat-eating dinosaur. And we found his skeletal remains around, and that's one example of it. Here's the skeletal remains of the, this is Beresovka. And I've seen this down there at the museum, and here's also the picture of him stuffed. Now, of course, they're going to have to take him all apart. That's why you're going to see him in 2 different stages. They've got to get everything apart in order to get it back on, or you're not going to preserve it whenever you bring it into a warm climate. Only reason it's been preserved has been in the cold climate the whole time. You see, you'll never unearth one of these in Minnesota. It would have rotted centuries ago, or something would have eaten it. So they've got to get it all taken apart so they can get it preserved like they want to. Okay, the question is, why haven't we found more of these? Let me give you some reasons why we haven't found more of these in Siberia. Because some of our critics will say, well, if they really existed, as if 39 is not proof enough. I'm talking about complete carcasses, that's proof enough for me. But as if that's not enough, why haven't we found more? Well, let me give you some reasons. First of all, the population there is extremely scarce. Therefore, someone's not going to just be out in their backyard and miss the electric line and hit the mammoth. There's no one lives there, so no one's going to find it unless it's an accident. You happen to be digging for gold, or for some other reason you happen to be exploring. But how many barren tolls do we have that want to explore Siberia? There are better ways to pass your Saturday afternoon. Another reason why we haven't found more is that this region is huge, composed of thousands and thousands of square miles. Now, a mammoth is a huge creature, but he's going to be difficult to find, buried 20 feet under nothing but solid ice when you're looking in thousands and thousands of square miles. We're blessed that we found 39, is the point. Thirdly, the natives that live on the outskirts of this region have been and are generally reluctant to talk to any outsiders about it, naturally because of unpleasant experiences they've had with the authorities in the past. You start telling people you found dinosaurs in your local region, and what are you going to have? Scientists up there bugging you all the time. So these are reasons that tell us why we haven't found as many of them as some people would like for us to have found. On the basis of the 39 that we have found, it's been estimated that there are 5 million woolly mammoth carcasses just in Siberia alone. Another way that you can prove that this is true is that during the summertime in the southern part of Siberia, or on the southern part of some of their islands in the Arctic Ocean, which do receive at least a relatively small amount of sun during the summertime, the stench is terrible whenever the sun gets very warm at all, which means there's a lot of rotting flesh somewhere. Now you see, the only time we find these is by some accident, and the only time it happens is in the summertime, and generally you've got like where most of them have been found is along a river or a creek bank that stays frozen over all the time until the summer. And it thaws out for a couple of weeks, and parts of the sides of the creek or the river bank fall in. And whenever they fall in, underneath all these sides, running along all these creeks and rivers, are found the carcasses of these mammoths. Now that's another reason why we don't find them except during this time period. And it's just a short time period when they can be unearthed. Sailors who do any sailing in that region, I remember reading in another book, testify to the fact that during the summertime when there's been any great thaw at all. Now, the temperatures there don't get like above 55, I think, during the summertime. They go back down below freezing every night. That only lasts a couple of weeks. So you can see you're going to have a little bit of a thaw, but not much of a thaw there. But the sailors who sail in this area, the Russian sailors who have been in this area, testify to the fact that when there is a small thaw in the region during the end of July, then mammoth bones can be found washed up on the shores of all the islands everywhere. So this what gives us the clue that there aren't like 100, there are 5 million of these creatures still buried. Most of them whole carcasses still buried somewhere in Siberia. Most of which, of course, we'll never find. Because the Russians, I believe, have drilled down there, and for 4,000 feet, they don't hit Earth yet. It's nothing but solid ice, 4,000 feet. Which means, hypothetically, and really it's more than that, it's a reality, that below that 4,000 feet you can still find carcasses there. But, I mean, you'd think they'd drill down 500 feet and you'd get through all that ice and hit the earth somewhere. But there is no earth to hit. Evidently, they just keep on drilling 4,000 feet. That's almost a mile. And nothing but solid ice. Very strange area there. And we're looking at all this in light of the Bible and the pre-flood and the post-flood description of the earth that we have in the book of Genesis. Now, remember from Genesis 1:31, there wasn't anything like this prior to the flood, or even prior to the fall, we could say. But then we can take it after that because the canopy effect was still intact. After the fall, this existed all the way until the time of the flood. We see that from chapter 7. It says that the water source came from the fountains and the floodgates. Another reason is the delay of the scientists in ever reaching these areas. Let's see, was it Berezovka that was 2 years? I believe this is the most famous one, and it was 2 years before the scientists ever reached it. You see, someone, a hunter or a trapper or a gold prospector or an explorer, or someone has to, first of all, make the discovery. Whenever they've made the discovery, about 90% of the time, they're not going to tell anyone about it. They don't want anyone bothering their territory. So in that small 10% we have left that are going to go and tell the authorities, it's going to take the authorities time to get there. Now, if they find it August the 5th, we could say they're out of luck because they're not going to get back to that until the next year. And if you've got a cold summer the next year and it doesn't fall at all, you're still not going to get to your creature. So you see what it can just go on, even though a creature has been unearthed. So there's some good reasons why we haven't found more. Another reason is because, I think I mentioned this one earlier, but I've really got it down for now, is that they can only be searched for during the summertime. And then a final reason why we haven't found more of these is the problem of carnivores. As soon as they are unearthed, the carnivores get to them right away because that's an easy meal to find. And this is what is so surprising to most of the scientists, that the meat of the creatures could actually be that well preserved after that long a time period. Now, you know as well as I do, you can't even let hamburger meat sit in your refrigerator more than, 3 or 4 or 5 days, and you're going to be reluctant to serve that. I don't know how long it lasts, but you go after 4 or 5 days of hamburger meat in the refrigerator, and it may be still edible, but you may want to pray twice over it, you and your husband, before you try eating it. In other words, these animals had to have been frozen, and frozen quickly. If they were frozen slowly, carnivores would have gotten to them. So something happened quickly, just like that, to put them in a deep sleep of deep freeze. And then covered them with water and ice, of course, which would have been, the water would have been frozen ice over them, which would have kept them away from any carnivores that came on the scene shortly after, long time afterwards, or however long you want to make it. Now, I'm talking around in circles. I'm trying to be vague because I don't want to get to all the answers yet this evening. We just want to set the scene of the woolly mammoth. Now, for our evolutionary friends or foes, and we're going to have to ask them, what are they going to do about this? And if they say, well, I'll agree, the earth was at one time tropical from east to west and pole to equator, then what caused it not to be tropical after a while? If you've got an effect, then you have to have a cause. Effects are always caused by causes, and so you've got to have one. Now, we might have one or two. They might not have any except, the Ice Age. Well, what caused the Ice Age? Where'd the ice come from then? See, there wasn't any ice up at the North Pole to slip down into North America. You see, that's basically what the Ice Age theory is all about. And you can see it on the dents and cuts that the ice has made in the rocks, the glaciers have made in the rocks. So the glaciers edged their way down. We had some unseasonably warm time periods, and they don't mean like a warm summer. They mean a warm 1,000-year or 2,000-year period, that all the ice began to head down this way. But if 90-foot plum trees were growing 600 miles north of the Arctic Circle, that's almost to the North Pole, then there couldn't have been any ice up there, could there? So we're back to either just throwing up our hands in despair or saying thank God for His Word. And of course we choose the latter of those two. What caused their death so suddenly? There are a lot of people that believe, we're talking about the mammoth still, that the woolly mammoth was an animal adapted from the cold, for the cold from the very beginning. And there are two reasons why they believe this. Some people believe that the region has always been cold, and just the name, the woolly mammoth, you have him pictured, and we saw pictures of him, a woolly animal. Now, haven't you always been taught, and haven't you always thought, until maybe just tonight, that that's why he had all the wool on him? Why wear all the wool? I've got a wool coat on tonight. Why wear all the wool unless it's pretty cold where you are? I mean, that's what I've always been taught. And I suppose that's what everyone's been taught. Consequently, there are some people that feel that the animal has always been adapted for cold regions for two reasons. One is because of the woolly coat. Why make an animal with fur like that if he was intended for a hot region in the beginning? Well, this reason breaks down in a hurry. Have you ever seen the fur on a tiger or a lion that lives in burning sun and heat? He has a thick fur that's pretty hard to pierce. So the thickness of the fur really doesn't have anything to do. As a matter of fact, I can make it stronger because we'll prove this next week. The thickness of the fur has nothing to do with how cold the region is or how warm the region is. So you remember that. Has nothing to do with it whatsoever. Now you might think the polar bear has a thick coat. Well, so do some black bears that live where it's warm, and they have a very thick coat on them. If you think the woolly mammoth had a thick woolly coat, then so does the tiger and the lion and just the old gorilla. He lives in tropical climate, but yet he's blessed with a very thick coat. So that must really, I mean, people who are naive and don't think, they put two and two together and get 18, and they think, well, I see a coat, it must be hot. I mean, we humans wear coats when it gets hot. I mean, when it gets cold, and we take them off whenever the temperature changes. So what would be the difference with the animals? Well, there's a big difference. They've got something that we don't have. Not to the degree that they have it. The second reason is because of the 9-centimeter layer of fat underneath their hide that they have. Answer to this is that for an animal of that size, 9 centimeters is like a piece of paper. It protects him from cold, not in the least. So both of these alleged answers and proofs for the adaptation to cold of the woolly mammoth really don't stand up. And besides that, what killed them was the cold. You see, we're seeing them living at a time when it wasn't cold. That's proven by the buttercups. That's proven by the plum tree. That's proven by the green grass he's lying on top of. And more than anything, it's proven by the unchewed bean pods that are still in his mouth. So that shows that before that time, which is when he had his woolly coat on, it wasn't cold there. And whenever it got cold, they died out, which must mean the cold was the very thing that did them in. And generally, I mean, if you've ever seen pictures in textbooks of the woolly mammoth, you see him treading through, feet of snow. And this isn't even Bible, friends. This is scientific facts proved to us that that's the one thing that destroyed the animal. If you ever find a textbook with a mammoth, the woolly mammoth, treading through great drifts of snow, it just proves they don't know anything about what's going on in the world and archaeology and the study of mammals today. Because that's the very thing that killed them. They're not up with their statistics and facts as they should be. Well, we've got several problems with the belief that they actually lived in this area, being animals adapted to the cold because it was cold. And I want to list these for you. One is that the woolly mammoth requires 2 tons of vegetation per week and 30 gallons of water per day. Remember, there's no water in Siberia. It's all ice. I guess you could sit down for a while and end up with some water, but it wouldn't be enough. Not 30 gallons per day. And secondly, the woolly mammoth, one thing that the woolly mammoth is absent in that our other creatures that live in the north have. Anyone know what that is? One thing he's missing. We're getting into it. I thought we'd get into it next week. We'll get into it right now. One thing that he's missing that you've got to have when it's cold. I'll give you an example while you're thinking. There's a story told, it's a true story, of a nasty group of blackbirds in West Virginia. The same thing happened in Alabama in the year 1977. I don't remember the date for the blackbirds in West Virginia, but this is the way the story was told. And you see this occasionally. You just get hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of blackbirds into your town, and there's just almost no way you can get rid of them. They just destroy everything. So they figured out one way to get rid of all the birds. What was that way they got rid of them? Anyone remember from the news?
Yeah, it was some kind of a chemical that destroyed...
What did it destroy? Before you go any further, that's right. It's a chemical that they sprayed out of planes. Now, what did it destroy?
It destroyed a substance that was in their feathers, which kept moisture from getting to their body.
What was that substance?
It was probably wax.
Oil. Oil, yeah. All you had to do is spray the chemicals. It destroyed the oil in their body. And it's rare, you see, when you ever see a wet bird, because he can hop down in the water and hop back out, and he doesn't need a towel or anything, because he's got oil supplied with him that just keeps the water off like water off a duck's back. That's where they got the term, because it just goes right off. Now, of course, some birds are better than others, especially your ducks. They're very good for that. When you watch your loon or something head underwater, and here he comes back up, and he doesn't have a drop of water on him. It's kind of like being clothed with a scuba diving suit. You head down, you come back up, and there goes all the water right off your back. Well, the one thing the woolly mammoth doesn't have, which the polar bear has, the raven has, the snowy owl has, the Arctic fox has, is an oil gland. You would have to have an oil gland to keep oil supplied over all of your coat to protect you from the cold. That's the one thing that it does, is protect you from the cold and, of course, the water as well. The woolly mammoth lacks this. Now, you see, we're not arguing against the fact that he didn't exist in Siberia and at the North Pole at one time. Our problem is the weather there of the region. Couldn't have been what it is today. And you see, the one way that we can prove this, we're going about it in a roundabout way, but the one way we can prove that the weather there at the North Pole and in northern Siberia today is a lot different than it used to be is the discovery of these woolly mammoth carcasses that we found. That's why they're so important to our way of thinking and to the scientific world, because they do prove right away that that territory was not cold at one time because of these statistics that we're giving you. And secondly, all the animals, all the carcasses that have been found have always been found in muck, M-U-C-K. You know what muck is? What's muck? It's frozen mud. Well, what does that tell you right away? You can't have mud in a frozen area unless it's frozen mud. But it had to be frozen at one time. You have mud where it's warm and where it rains and where you've got a lot of water around where you can end up with muddy soil. And all of the carcasses have been found in muck, frozen mud. Which again means that we've had a tremendous change here in this territory. Now you say, well, the flood's what destroyed all of the mammoths. But it would have just washed them away. I mean, remember, some of them are preserved in an upright walking position. I've got more to say, but that sounds like it's quite enough to maybe leave you on that note. Well, no, I think I'll leave you right there because that'll give us just enough to get into again next time.
For a complete list of Brother Ross's tapes and books, please write Faith